The Unmarked by Matt Fleagle. Chapter 16. Beyond the Gate. Everyone held his breath at the sight of the magnificent beast. The creature had no scales, nor smoke sliding out of its wide nostrils, as the old legends and drawings had led Dellbloods and forest animals alike to picture when thinking of dragons. Instead, the creature was short-legged, at least in comparison to the length of its body, and serpentine in shape. Bristling orange fur ran along its sides from near its tail all the way up to its sharply ridged head and lustrous yellow and black eyes. The dragon's broad, outstretched wings were covered in bluish feathers, fringed about with the same orange fur that covered its torso. Its ears were small, bent back against its sleek head. Kaleb guessed that the dragon pinned its ears close to its skull to avoid deafening itself every time it screeched. The dragon's claws were splayed out in 3 black-tipped talons against the hard cobblestone, and the creature's back limbs, though short, were immense, powerful enough to crush stone with one quick thrust, yet nimble enough to drop from the sky like an arrow off a string, and alight gracefully on whatever crag it settled on below. Exhaling steamy breath from its half-open mouth, the dragon crouched with its back facing Kaleb and the others. Then it let out a low, ticking sound, half a rasp and half a growl. The stone-render guards in front of the dragon were too paralyzed with horror to attack or try to evade the towering beast. They shuffled about to stay clear of its twitching tail, more cat-like than reptilian. The dragon suddenly bent toward Freylin and blinked its narrow eyes at the old scout. Freylin's breath came in short, anxious pulls. He extended his sword toward the dragon, preparing to defend himself, yet no one present would have taken up a wager that Freylin could slay this giant beast. Decades of combat training were useless against a foe of this size and speed. Freylin would be crushed under the weight of the dragon's foot seconds after the fight began. Freylin's hands trembled violently, sword clenched tightly between them, but he did not budge from his position. The dragon pranced effortlessly up to Freylin on its nimble legs. Stopping just short of the old man, the beast extended its long neck and sniffed at Freylin's gray head. He stood still as hot dragon breath swept through his thinning hair. Kaleb clutched his axe tighter between his sweating palms, wondering if the old scout considered it wiser to remain motionless than to flee. The dragon took a step back, then swiveled on its short but mighty hind legs to take a look at Grimwit, Teva, and Kaleb. A strange glimmer came into its bright black and gold eyes. "What shall we do?" whispered Kaleb to Glista. Glista shook her head weakly and said nothing. "Teva, you know more about beasts than I or Glista," Kaleb said. "Can you read the look in that dragon's eyes? Does it look like it wants to harm us?" "Strangely, I think not," said Teva. "Neither do I," added Grimwit in a subdued voice. The guards at the dragon's back regained their senses. With the dragon facing their opponents, they saw an advantage. As one man, the scouts rushed Freylin, swords raised. Freylin heard their swift footsteps and swiveled toward them, lifting his weapon to engage his foes. But just when the scouts were almost on top of Freylin, the dragon revolved on his taloned feet with incredible speed. It leapt over Freylin's crouching body and landed in front of him, creating a barrier between Freylin and his attackers. The dragon brought down one foot directly upon a scout. With its other foreleg, the dragon swatted a second attacker into a stone wall off to the right. The other scouts shouted in surprise. They staggered backward, hoping to avoid the next sweep of the creature's immense limbs and tail. Is that beast defending Freylin?" said Matt. "It seems to be," muttered Glista, a note of surprise in her voice. Whether the dragon favors our side in the skirmish or not, we must seize on this distraction to get through that door, Kaleb said, looking past the dragon toward the west gate. The beast was now roaring at the scouts, who could do little but brandish their swords futilely in its face. With Glista leading, the fugitives raced toward the border of the wide street. Then, cloaked by the commotion of the stone renders contending with the dragon, Kaleb and the others flanked the guards and dashed toward the undefended gate. Suddenly, Kaleb heard Madge scream, "Father!" They all turned around to see what had happened. Apparently, the scout who had been trapped under the weight of the dragon's sharp talons had managed to slide out between the creature's long toes. In the process of fleeing the dragon, the scout had rolled right into Freylin, who was at the same moment scrambling to avoid an incidental collision with the massive beast's hind legs. After toppling to the ground, Freylin and the other scout lay startled in the street for a few seconds. Then, the young guard, who recovered his senses a split second earlier than Freylin, called out, "Traitor!" and fell upon Freylin, clamping his strong hands around the older scout's neck. Freylin wrestled to free himself from the stone render's grasp, but to no avail. His face grew pale as his empty lungs begged for air. "Madge, wait!" Kaleb shouted. The girl had rushed into the center of the street where the two men were tussling. She skipped over the narrow edge of the dragon's tail to reach Freylin. Without hesitating, she leapt onto the back of the scout, strangling her father, and with a weak but determined fist struck the man several times on his shoulder and in his ribcage. The scout cursed at her, but refused to release his grip on Freylin, whose eyes had begun to close. Kaleb and Glista chased Madge into the center of the fray. The dragon meanwhile shrieked and kicked its hind legs out at the stone renders. The detachment of scouts were finally piecing together a strategy to counter the superior size and speed of the beast. Fanning out around their winged enemy, they made it increasingly difficult for the dragon to keep its yellow and black eyes fixed on all of them at once. Glista and Kaleb reached Freylin. Seizing Freylin's attacker by the shoulders, Kaleb managed to pull him off of the suffocating old man. Freylin's assailant fell backwards onto the cobblestone. After landing with a thud and a groan, the agile guard quickly scrambled back to his feet. Before he could lay hands on Kaleb, Glista struck a sharp blow to the scout's head, using the blunt end of her hilt. He fell unconscious to the ground. "Madge, get to the gate," Freylin ordered through hoarse gasps for air. But Madge remained put, her wide eyes roving between the dragon and the unconscious scout next to her father. Suddenly, a commanding voice rang out from the other end of the road. "Aim for its back, fools! The dragon has no scales to protect its hide." It was the voice of Verlisden. Having shouted this, Verlisden hurled her sword and branch through the air and directly into the dragon's back, just above its tail. The dragon shrieked in pain, but kept fighting with its teeth and talons. The sword remained lodged deep in the dragon's hind flesh. Black blood oozed out, staining the creature's orange fur. For a moment, the dragon reeled back, trying to extract the weapon from its back by use of its long, bared teeth. This left the dragon's underbelly exposed. A clever scout crouched near the dragon's forelegs, saw his chance, and rushed under the beast, sword extended for a lethal plunge into the beast's underside. Before he could, however, Grimwit and Teva sped towards the attacker. Seizing the back of the scout's uniform between their teeth, they yanked him swiftly away from the dragon, while he kicked and shouted violently at them. Kaleb realized their window for escape was closing. "We must go," he shouted to his friends. Grimwit, Teva, and Glista all raced back to Kaleb's side. The log splitter had been steadying Freylin, who took some time to regain his breath. Freylin tapped Kaleb's arm and pointed at a large pulley fixed to the interior of the city wall. "The gate. That will bring the gate. Drop it down," he panted. Madge, Tava, Grimwit, Glista, this is it, called Kaleb through the loud clamor all around. Run! On my back, little one, said Grimwit, nudging Madge onto his powerful shoulders. Weakly, she knelt down, allowing Tava to push her onto the bear's back. Over his shoulder, Grimwit called, Hold on tight. Madge sunk her hands into the bear's thick fur and pressed herself against his sturdy back as the bear lumbered toward the gate. Tava followed close behind. The dragon, with one more agonized roar, stretched its feathered wings and swept them over the cobblestone ground. A rush of whistling air lifted the beast off the ground as, with a swipe of its tail, the dragon dislodged the enchanted sword from its flesh. The weapon fell onto the stone street with a terrible clank. By this time, the escape party had almost cleared the gate. Kaleb and Glista passed through, with Tava and Grimwit, Madge still clinging to his back, close behind them. Freyland half ran, half limped behind them, but stopped before he reached the gate. Glista turned and saw he was carrying something in his hands. "What are you doing, Freyland?" shouted Glista, peering back through the open gate into the city. Freyland had shifted course. He was now standing just inside the west gate, next to the crank that lowered the giant steel gate to the ground. Kaleb sprinted back to the gate and stood opposite of Freyland, just outside the city entrance. "I have to close this gate. It will slow your pursuers down," panted Freyland. Kaleb glanced over Freyland's shoulder. The disheveled scouts, regrouping from the dragon's attack, were staggering toward the gate. Verlisden was pointing furiously at the city exit and barking orders. They would be on Freyland in a few short moments. "Freyland, leave the gate alone. You must come with us," pleaded Kaleb. "One of us has to stay, to close it," protested Freyland. "You cannot lower it in time. That rope is too strong," said Kaleb, motioning toward the top of the pulley with his axe. "It would take 3 of us together to get that knot undone and turn the crank that lowers the gate." A smile flashed in Freyland's eyes. He reached down to pick up something he had placed on the ground when he gripped the crank. "This might do it," he said. Kaleb watched as Freyland picked up Verlisden's sword, interlaced with the sacred branch. "What are you doing, Freyland?" "The magic of this weapon could serve where human strength fails," Freyland said. With that, he raised his arms, and with a fierce groan brought the enchanted blade down on the rope that suspended the gate. The rope split like old yarn, and with a tremendous crash, the steel gate fell to the ground, barring the scouts from the escaping fugitives, and separating Freyland from Kaleb. Kaleb ran up to the thick iron bars and peered through them. "Freyland, how will you get out?" he shouted. The scouts were now 50 yards from Freyland and closing in. At the sight of Verlisden's enchanted sword and Freyland's scraped-up hands, they hesitated, but only for a moment. Verlisden's sharp threats propelled them forward. One of the men in the front called, "Don't lose courage, men. We have him outnumbered." "Freyland, you cannot stay here," said Kaleb. "They will kill you." "I have her blade, friend. That will stay me for a little while. At least—" Here he paused momentarily. "At least long enough to get you and my daughter away from Ablerin." "I cannot leave you to die, Freyland. There must be another door nearby, some way for you to get out." Freyland shook his head, eyes calm and resolute. "Take care of my daughter, Dellblood," said the old scout in a quiet voice. "You have the look of a decent man, whatever marks you may or may not have." With that, Freyland turned, and gripping Verlisden's blade in his hands, deflected the first blows of the scouts that swarmed him. The enchanted weapon kept his attackers at bay, at least for the moment. With each stroke, the old man managed to knock a few of them to the ground. Finally, Kaleb could see Freyland no more through the flurry of steel blades and black uniforms. The log splitter clenched the wide bars of the city gate and for a moment tried to lift them with his brawny arms. His muscles buckled under the weight of the gate. He realized there was nothing more he could do to save Freyland. Kaleb turned around. His companions were waiting on him at the base of a hill that descended from the gate into the forest to the west of the city. "Go! Go!" Kaleb yelled down to them. Kaleb heard the dragon let out one last, ear-splitting shriek as it circled the city. Then it disappeared into the thick clouds forming east of Ablerin. Kaleb raced down the hill. He waved for his remaining companions, who had paused there, to make haste toward the thick woods to the south. Behind him, he heard Freyland's voice ring out above the clanging of swords. "For the old Ablerin, for the elders, for a world without corruption and cruelty, I defy you all to stand against Verlisden." Soon the growing distance between Kaleb and the city made the commotion behind the west gate inaudible. When he caught up to them, Madge lifted her head off of Grimwit's back and yelled, "Where is my father, Kaleb?" Kaleb wiped his eyes, but did not answer her. He commanded them all to keep moving forward. Madge sobbed and slumped against the broad back of Grimwit. The bear bounded across the descending plains outside of Ablerin in step with Teva, who ran alongside him. Each set of weary eyes were fixed on the sheltering tree line at the edge of the woods some distance beyond them. What seemed like an hour later, the panting group crossed into the thick trees almost a mile south of Ablerin's outer walls. They all collapsed to the forest floor, even the wolf and bear, gasping with exhaustion. As soon as they caught their breaths, the four of them cast wary eyes back at Ablerin. Their pursuers were nowhere in sight. Then Kaleb dropped his axe, pressed his face into the thistly ground of the forest, and wept.